In this video, we're going to be talking about information represented in tables. So in this table, the information shown is on population size and carbon emissions generated in the Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei region in China. So this context is again repeated in the title of the table, which shows you exactly the same thing. So for this table, there are actually a few questions that can be asked. The first one, because the years are shown here, the question can ask you about describing the trend over time. So describe the trend of carbon emissions over time, describe the trend of population size over time. So let's look at carbon emissions first. Remembering what a describe trend question should be answered or how it should be answered, look at the starting year here. 2007, 304 million tons. Remember the units. At the end, 2050, you get 343 million tons. So overall, you get an increase in carbon emissions. If you look at the population size here, and again, the units are in 10,000s. In 2007, 9734, 10,000s. In 2015, 11142, 10,000s. And that means that overall, it increased. Beyond just the trend, a question can be asked about the relationship between population and carbon emissions. Logically, you would know that when the population increases because of things that people do, the goods that people need to manufacture, agricultural crops that need to be grown, all these things contribute to carbon emission increase. So logically, you would see that when the population increases, carbon emissions would also increase. So we see that the overall trend matches. We can say that this is a positive relationship. Plus for positive. I can also describe this relationship to be direct. Alternatively, I can even just use plain words to describe it. When the population increases, the carbon emissions generated also increases. So any way is fine. To prove the relationship, I need to quote data from the figure. So I'm going to quote data such as this, 304 to 343, to show that there was an increase overall. I'm going to quote this number, 9734, 11142, to show that there's also an increase overall. However, there is an exception to this relationship. If you look very closely, you would notice that for these years, 2013 to 2015, the population increased, but the carbon emissions decreased. So what you want to highlight is that while the overall relationship is positive, is direct, however, there are certain years whereby the relationship seems to be the exception. So highlight the overall trend and the exception. Moving on to a different kind of table. So in this case, the table shows you tourism expenditure by visitors traveling overseas from ASEAN 6 countries, which actually means that all these countries, when Indonesians travel abroad, how much they spend, when Malaysians travel abroad, how much they spend. Okay, this context is repeated again in the title here. And take note that the units here is in US dollars, millions of US dollars. So whatever number you see there, times a million. So from this table, what you can gather is the trend over time. Take note also, these are estimated figures, so 2022 onwards are estimated, which then signals to you that this graph or this table is probably done up at a certain time here between 2021 and 2022, or in 2022 when the 2022 figures are not in yet, but the 2021 figures are already in. So take note of such things, because sometimes when you're asked to describe the limitations of that particular figure, these are things that you can pick up on. So another type of question that they can test you is the trend over time, because you have the years here. They can ask you, maybe in total, in ASEAN 6, what is the overall trend? How did it change over time? So looking across the years here, over time, 89,000 to 100,000, which tells you then there's an increase over time. But of course, in the middle here, you'll notice some years had an extreme decrease. This part here, before it rolls up again. So exception, and then overall trend is increase. Another type of question that they can test you is about the distribution. So the distribution of the total expenditure here. So what I mean is this, for example, if they ask you a question, projected in 2025, what is the distribution of expenditure of tourists from different countries out of the whole of ASEAN? So distribution just means proportion. And when they ask you about distribution questions, look at what is the most, what is the least, what is in between. So depending on the number of marks of the question, you just write the respective number of points. So the most here, you can see that it should be Singapore. 31,000 times million, which essentially means billion, 31 billion, in terms of US dollars, in terms of expenditure. So I can actually quote this figure. Singapore has the highest proportion out of the total ASEAN 6. 31 billion out of 100 billion. If I want to do calculations, you can actually convert this as a percentage, which gets you about 30% or 31%. Okay, so quote the numbers or calculate the percentage, up to you. So if Singapore's the highest, let's look at the reverse then. What's on the extreme opposite? That would be Vietnam here. 8149. That's about 8%. So I can talk about Singapore, I'll talk about Vietnam. What is another country I want to pick? So you can go for the second highest or the second lowest. So second highest, you would see Thailand here. So you can quote that number. Second lowest, you can see Philippines here. You can also quote that number. So the same applies for any other year they pick, and they ask you to describe the distribution of the figures.